A few months ago, my partner and I decided to take a spontaneous weekend getaway. We found a charming Airbnb listing nestled in the heart of a cozy mountain town. The picturesque photos online promised an escape from our hectic lives, but we had no idea that our retreat would soon take a dark and terrifying turn. The Airbnb was a cozy cottage with a rustic feel, nestled within a tranquil forest. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind. Our host, a friendly woman named Carol, welcomed us and assured us of our privacy during our stay. Everything seemed idyllic, at least in the beginning. The first day was spent exploring the charming town, enjoying local cuisine, and hiking along the beautiful forest trails. We were in awe of the breathtaking natural beauty and relished the peace and quiet. However, as night descended, we began to notice subtle, unsettling occurrences. We'd hear faint whispers outside our cottage window, always just beyond the edge of audibility. At first, we dismissed it as the imagination playing tricks on us, but as the days passed, the whispering grew more persistent. One evening, while we were curled up on the couch, a loud thud against the window startled us. We rushed to the window and saw nothing outside. We laughed it off as a branch or some small animal, but the unease began to fester. Soon, we noticed that our belongings were not where we left them. Items would inexplicably shift from one room to another, and doors would open and close on their own. We questioned each other, suspecting the other of pranks, but the genuine fear in each other's eyes confirmed that something was very wrong. The real nightmare began when we found a chilling message written on the bathroom mirror, scrawled in what looked like red lipstick. "I'm always watching." We were gripped by fear and paranoia. We reached out to Carol, our host, to inquire if there had been any strange incidents in the area. Her response was baffling. She claimed no knowledge of any disturbances, ensuring us that our privacy was secure. Our unease escalated into fear and panic. We set up a camera in the living room, hoping to capture any strange occurrences. What we saw in the footage would haunt us for the rest of our lives. In the dim light, a shadowy figure obscured by the hood of a dark cloak emerged from the corners of the room. It moved with an eerie fluidity, standing still for hours on end, staring at our sleeping forms. The figure never made a sound, but its presence was palpable. We called the police, but when they arrived, the stalker had vanished. They assured us they would patrol the area, but without evidence of a crime, there was little they could do. The terror persisted, the stalking relentless. We decided to cut our vacation short, packed our bags, and left the Airbnb, not looking back. We never discovered the identity of our tormentor. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when my friend and I embarked on a long-anticipated road trip to explore the historic sites and picturesque landscapes of New England. Excitement filled the air as we navigated the winding roads, making our way to a quaint town nestled deep in the heart of Vermont. Our Airbnb adventure was about to take an unexpected and terrifying turn. The Airbnb listing had seemed promising, picturesque, a charming rural cottage, and a host with rave reviews named Olivia. She was described as hospitable and kind, known for making her guests feel right at home. Our expectations were high as we approached the remote cottage, surrounded by dense forests and the promise of tranquility. As we arrived, Olivia greeted us with a warm smile, offering a tour of the Pictures of previous guests were displayed prominently on the walls, each with peculiar, almost obsessive captions written beneath them. Olivia herself was friendly, but increasingly eccentric. She insisted on joining us for every meal, often making disconcerting remarks about the connections she felt with previous guests. Her eyes held an unsettling intensity, and she seemed overly interested in our personal lives. The true horror began when Olivia insisted on showing us her personal art collection. The walls of her home were adorned with macabre paintings, many of which seemed to depict violent scenes and grotesque imagery. Our unease deepened as we reluctantly followed her through the cottage, which felt like a nightmarish art gallery. As night descended, the atmosphere grew even more unsettling. Olivia's behavior became erratic as she spoke about the spiritual energy of the place and the sacrifices she had made to maintain it. She became fixated on the idea that we were part of a sacred ritual and needed to contribute to her art. Fear had us in its grip as Olivia's true intentions became chillingly clear. She locked the doors and windows, refusing to let us leave, claiming that we were now part of her twisted collection. The air grew heavy with dread as we realized that our Airbnb host was not only eccentric, but dangerously unhinged. We knew that we had to escape, but Olivia's watchful eye was relentless. In a desperate attempt to outwit her, we feigned compliance, waiting for the right moment to make our move. It was a game of survival against an increasingly erratic adversary. Our chance came when Olivia momentarily left the room. We seized the opportunity, made a daring escape through an open window, and sprinted through the woods, putting as much distance as possible between us and the cottage of horrors. We reached the nearest town and alerted the authorities. They were familiar with Olivia, as she had a history of disturbing behavior. Our account, combined with her unsettling art collection, led to her arrest. What drove Olivia to such madness? Our Airbnb stay had taken a nightmarish turn, and we were fortunate to escape with our lives and our sanity intact. The Airbnb was a quaint cottage surrounded by lush woods, offering seclusion and a break from the chaos of the city. The host, Alex, was charming and welcoming. We arrived on a Friday evening, excited to unwind and explore the charming town. The first night was perfect. We lit a fire in the cozy living room, shared stories, and savored a home-cooked meal. The sense of tranquility was intoxicating, but that serenity would be shattered on the second night. Around midnight, we were jolted awake by the blaring sound of sirens and shouting voices. Confusion turned into panic as we rushed to the windows. Outside, our peaceful haven had transformed into a chaotic battleground. Red and blue lights painted the trees, illuminating a scene straight out of a nightmare. Men with balaclavas and firearms were swarming the property. We were trapped, unable to escape without being spotted. Terror gripped us as we realized that our Airbnb had been raided by the police. But this was no ordinary raid. It was clear that something sinister was happening. The officers seemed heavily armed, and their actions were erratic. It wasn't a regular law enforcement operation. This was something far more dangerous. We hid in the cottage, trying to make sense of what was happening. The air was thick with tension as we heard muffled conversations outside. The occasional burst of gunfire pierced the night, making our hearts race. Hours passed, but it felt like an eternity. We whispered to one another, wondering if we were caught in the crossfire of a drug deal gone wrong, or something even more sinister. Our phones were useless, the signal was jammed, and we had no way to call for help. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, the chaos outside finally began to subside. We cautiously peered out the window to see officers leading a group of handcuffed men away. It was evident that this wasn't the peaceful town we had imagined. The ordeal left us shaken, but our main concern was our safety. We decided to wait until things had settled further and the authorities had left the area. It wasn't until late afternoon that we felt it was safe to leave our hiding spot. We gathered our belongings and left the Airbnb, never looking back. Miami, known for its vibrant nightlife and beautiful beaches, seemed like the perfect place to host Airbnb guests. My partner and I had opened our doors to travelers for years, and our experiences had always been pleasant, until one fateful encounter with a guest that we would never forget. It was a hot summer evening when our guest, Mark, arrived. He was friendly, had glowing reviews, and was in town for a week-long vacation. Everything seemed ordinary, and our hopes for a peaceful stay were high. Little did we know that Mark was anything but ordinary. In the beginning, Mark appeared like any other guest. He explored the city during the day and came back to the Airbnb in the evenings. However, as the days passed, his behavior grew increasingly bizarre. He would lock himself in the bedroom for hours on end, talking to someone who wasn't there. We'd hear him engaged in heated arguments, punctuated by frenzied laughter. The conversations seemed to become more intense, often disturbing the tranquility of our home. Worried, we gently knocked on his door, asking if everything was okay. He would answer that he was just having some personal issues, but assured us he was fine. As hosts, we respected his privacy and thought nothing of it. Little did we know that Mark's problems would soon become our nightmare. One evening, Mark emerged from his room with wild eyes and erratic movements. He claimed that the Airbnb was now his, that he had paid for it, and that he was not going anywhere. We were taken aback by his sudden change in demeanor, but we tried to remain calm and resolve the situation amicably. It became apparent that Mark was delusional, as he continued to insist that the property was now his, citing imaginary contracts and fabricated agreements. We felt a growing sense of unease and fear as his behavior became more unpredictable. As tensions escalated, Mark barricaded himself inside the Airbnb, refusing to leave. We reached out to Airbnb for help, but the process was slow and arduous. Mark's terrifying presence was relentless. He vandalized our property, broke our belongings, and caused constant disruptions, leaving us with no choice but to call the police. When the officers arrived, Mark had locked himself inside his room, and the standoff continued for hours. After what felt like an eternity, the police managed to apprehend Mark, who was forcefully removed from the property. The nightmare was over, but the psychological scars remained. We had invited a guest into our home and watched as he turned into a threatening intruder. As hosts, we had opened our doors to the world, but we had never expected that this would ever happen. Nestled along the picturesque coast of Brazil, I had been hosting guests in my charming vacation rental for several years. The lush landscapes and warm hospitality made it an ideal location for travelers seeking an unforgettable getaway. But one ominous event would cast a shadow over my serene retreat, forever changing my perspective on hosting. It was an ordinary evening when I I received an email notification from the vacation rental platform. A new review had been posted on my property. Reviews were not just a testament to my hospitality, but they also played a significant role in attracting new guests. I eagerly clicked on the notification, curious to see what the recent guest had to say. To my shock and disbelief, the review was a scathing account of a nightmarish experience. The guest claimed that my vacation rental was plagued by cleanliness issues, pests, and a host who was entirely unresponsive. The words hit me like a freight train, leaving me stunned and dismayed. What was most unsettling was that I had no recollection of the guest who had posted this review. I scoured my booking history, reviewed past interactions, and realized that there had been no guest matching the name provided in the review. It was as if this guest had never stayed at my property, and the review was a malevolent fabrication. I quickly reached out to the vacation rental platform, assuming it was a case of mistaken identity, or perhaps a glitch in the system. The response I received, however, sent chills down my spine. The platform insisted that the review was legitimate, and that the guest had indeed stayed at my property. Desperate for clarity, I asked for more information about the guest, hoping to verify their identity and address the situation. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. The guest's profile was devoid of any personal information or photographs. It was as if they were a ghost, an entity without a traceable identity. Fearing the impact of this false review on my hosting reputation, I reached out to the vacation rental platform again, imploring them to investigate further. To my dismay, they cited privacy policies and refused to reveal the guest's identity. I was trapped in a web of deception with no recourse for justice. As the weeks passed,
I received a series of cryptic messages from the mysterious guest. They seemed to know intimate details about my life and the vacation rental, despite my best efforts to maintain anonymity. It was as if they were watching me, haunting me with their knowledge. My once tranquil hosting experience had transformed into a waking nightmare. I lived in a state of constant fear, my sanctuary forever tainted by the malevolent actions of an unknown adversary. Friends and family dismissed my concerns as mere online harassment, but I knew it was something far more sinister. Desperate to uncover the truth, I hired a private investigator. What they uncovered sent shivers down my spine. The guest's email address was a labyrinth of deception, with a string of false identities and aliases. Their digital trail was carefully erased, and the origin of their messages remained untraceable. The investigator speculated that the false review and the subsequent harassment were part of a sinister plot, but the motive remained an enigma. It was a meticulously orchestrated campaign to torment me, leaving me with a haunting question. Who was this person, and what did they hope to achieve? It was a warm summer evening when I decided to take a much-needed break and booked an Airbnb in the heart of Atlanta. The reviews were glowing, the pictures were inviting, and the host seemed friendly, so I had high hopes for my upcoming stay. Upon arriving at the Airbnb, I was greeted by a quaint, historic house in a peaceful neighborhood. It was everything I had hoped for: charming, well-kept, and seemingly the perfect place to relax during my stay in Atlanta. The host, Susan, warmly welcomed me and showed me around the house, assuring me that my visit would be comfortable and enjoyable. The first night was uneventful, and I slept soundly in my cozy room.
However, as the sun dipped below the horizon on the following evening, the atmospheres in the house began to change. A sense of unease settled in as I heard faint, unsettling whispers in the corridors. I dismissed them as figments of my imagination, a result of being in an unfamiliar place. But things took a sinister turn when I woke up in the middle of the night to a series of dissonant and haunting sounds. It was as if the house itself had come alive with eerie creaks and ghostly whispers. I felt an unexplainable dread creeping over me. Curiosity led me to explore the house, where I discovered something that sent chills down my spine. Hidden behind a wall in the basement, there was a collection of eerie and unsettling items, old photographs, strange symbols, and handwritten notes that seemed to hint at something sinister. It was as if the house held secrets that I was never meant to discover. I confronted Susan about my findings the next morning, but she seemed unfazed, brushing it off as a misunderstanding. She assured me that the house had a history, like many old properties, and that there was nothing to be concerned about. However, her nonchalant response did little to ease my growing anxiety. As the days passed, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors that I had closed would inexplicably open, and I would often find objects rearranged in ways that I couldn't explain. The unsettling whispers persisted, and I began to feel a constant sense of being watched. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. They were slow and deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. My heart raced as I strained to see who was there, but there was no one in sight. The footsteps continued, almost as if someone invisible was moving through the house. Terrified, I decided I could no longer stay in the house.
I hastily packed my belongings and left a note for Susan, explaining that I couldn't endure the unnerving atmosphere any longer. I booked a hotel room and left the Airbnb behind, eager to escape the inexplicable horrors that had plagued my stay. The nightmares didn't end with my departure from the Airbnb. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, and the unsettling whispers seemed to have become a permanent presence in my life. It was as if the sinister energy of that house had latched onto me, refusing to let go. To this day, I can't explain the horrifying events that unfolded during my stay, and I've come to believe that some places are just cursed. It was a weekend getaway I had eagerly anticipated. I'd booked a charming Airbnb cottage, nestled deep in the woods of a quiet, remote town in the Appalachian Mountains. The place was picturesque, surrounded by lush forests and far from the noise and chaos of the city. Little did I know that this serene setting would soon become the backdrop for a nightmarish experience I could never have imagined. Upon arrival, the host, a friendly man named Richard, greeted me warmly. He showed me around the cottage, assuring me that I would have a peaceful and private stay. With a sense of tranquility, I settled in for my first evening in this idyllic haven. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cozied up by the fireplace, lost in the pages of a book. The night was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. It was the kind of solitude I had longed for. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a series of loud noises that echoed through the woods. It sounded like gunshots, and panic instantly gripped me. My first instinct was to turn off the lights and hide in the cottage's bedroom. From the window, I peered out into the darkness, trying to make sense of the chaos. To my horror, I saw several realized that these gunmen had stumbled upon my remote hideaway. I had no way of contacting the authorities. There was no cell signal in this isolated location. My only option was to hide and pray that they would pass by without discovering me. I huddled in the bedroom, my heart pounding with fear as the footsteps drew nearer. The harsh beams of their flashlights sliced through the curtains, casting eerie shadows on the walls. My mind raced, and every breath felt like an audible echo in the suffocating silence. The men entered the cottage, their voices hushed but determined. They were searching each room, coming closer to my hiding spot with each passing moment. I knew that if they found me, there would be no escape from this remote nightmare. Time seemed to stretch into an eternity as I listened to their movements, desperately willing them to leave. After what felt like an eternity, the gunmen exited the cottage. I could hear their voices fading into the distance as they continued their search in the woods. I stayed hidden in that bedroom for hours, paralyzed with fear. When dawn finally broke, I emerged cautiously, fearing that the gunmen might return. But the cottage was empty, and the terrifying ordeal had passed. I quickly gathered my belongings and
left that fucking Airbnb. What was supposed to be a peaceful retreat was now forever tainted by the events of this night. I reported the incident to the authorities, but the damn gunmen were never apprehended.
A few years ago, I decided to take a solo trip to New Orleans. To make the experience unique and immerse myself in the local culture, I opted to stay in an Airbnb in one of the historic neighborhoods. Little did I know that this decision would lead me down a path of darkness I could never have imagined. Upon arriving in the vibrant city, I was greeted to be the charm and mystique that New Orleans is famous for. The Airbnb I had booked was an old, quaint house nestled in a lively, historic neighborhood. The host, a woman named Marianne, had glowing reviews and appeared friendly in our messages. The first few days of my trip were fantastic. I explored the city, enjoyed local cuisine, and even made a few friends. New Orleans was living up to its reputation as a city of music, culture, and celebration. However, as the weekend approached, I began to notice something disturbing about the Airbnb I was staying in. Late at night, I could hear strange noises coming from the neighboring rooms. At first, I dismissed them as regular household sounds. However, the noises grew louder and more unsettling. Conversations that I couldn't quite make out, footsteps in the hallway, and occasional laughter that seemed out of place for a residential neighborhood. One evening, as I was returning to my room after a long day of exploring, I encountered a woman in the hallway. She was dressed provocatively and gave me a seductive smile as she passed by. It was clear she was not a fellow traveler, but rather a working woman. I was taken aback, but tried to put it out of my mind, thinking it was a one-time occurrence. As the days went by, the situation in the Airbnb deteriorated. It became increasingly apparent that the house was being used as a hub for prostitution. The guests coming and going at odd hours, the suggestive advertisements left in plain sight, and the unending stream of strangers created an atmosphere of dread. One night I was awakened by a commotion coming from the room next door. Frightened, I listened in as a heated argument unfolded. It became clear that one of the guests was a sex worker, and a dispute had broken out over payment. The argument escalated, leading to a violent struggle that left me paralyzed with fear. I realized I couldn't stay in this environment any situation to Airbnb, hoping they would take action against the host and rectify the situation. However, I never received a response from Marion, and the listing remained active on the platform. A few years ago, I embarked on a solo trip to a charming European city that had always been on my bucket list. To make the experience more immersive, I decided to book an Airbnb in a historic part of town. It was the perfect opportunity to immerse myself in the local culture. Little did I know that this decision would lead to a nightmarish ordeal that would haunt me for years to come. Upon my arrival, I was captivated by the beauty and culture of the city. The Airbnb I had booked was an elegant apartment in a centuries-old building. The host, who went by the name Gabriella, had glowing reviews and appeared welcoming and hospitable in our correspondence. The first few days were absolutely delightful. I explored the city's historic sites, indulged in the local cuisine, and reveled in the vibrant atmosphere. It was a dream come true. However, as the week progressed, I began to notice something profoundly unsettling about the Airbnb I was staying in. Late at night, I would hear faint whispers and the clicking of a keyboard coming from the host's room, which was next to mine. I dismissed it initially, thinking Gabriella was simply working late. But over time, the sounds grew more disturbing, with the hushed conversations turning into heated arguments and eerie laughter that sent shivers down my spine. One evening, while returning to the apartment, I couldn't help but overhear a phone conversation that further raised my suspicions. Gabriella was speaking in a hushed, urgent tone, saying something about access codes and transferring funds. My heart pounded as I realized there was something deeply sinister afoot. Concerned, I decided to do some research of my own. I soon discovered that the woman who called herself Gabriella had used a fake identity and a fictitious profile. I couldn't find any trace of her existence beyond the Airbnb listing. A sense of dread washed over me as I feared what Gabriella might be involved in. Late one night, as curiosity and fear compelled me to investigate further, I discovered a hidden room in the apartment. It was filled with an array of sophisticated computer equipment, monitors displaying intricate codes, and stacks of passports and identification documents. My heart raced as I realized that I was staying in the lair of a cybercriminal, a hacker with a fake identity who had been monitoring my every move. Terrified, I immediately contacted the authorities and vacated the apartment. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Gabriella had been hacking into her guests' bank accounts, siphoning off their savings with her intricate schemes. I was one of the fortunate ones who escaped her clutches, but many others had fallen victim to her elaborate web of deception. My dream trip had turned into a living nightmare, and it forever changed the way I view the sharing economy. A few years ago, I embarked on a solo trip to the picturesque town of Cedar Hollow, nestled in the heart of a densely forested region. Eager to experience the serenity of nature, I chose to stay in an Airbnb cottage, secluded from the hustle and bustle of city life. What I envisioned as a peaceful retreat quickly turned into a horrifying ordeal that still haunts my nightmares. Upon arriving, the cottage looked exactly as it did in the photos, a charming, rustic retreat that was perfect for those seeking solace. The host, a man named Daniel, appeared friendly and reliable in our communication. Everything seemed to be going as planned until my third night in the As I was preparing for a cozy evening indoors, I heard a blood-curdling scream echoing from the depths of the forest. My heart raced, and I grabbed a flashlight to investigate. The sound had come from a neighboring cabin, another Airbnb rental. I rushed to the cabin and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Fearing the worst, I contacted the authorities. Within minutes, 2 policemen arrived at the scene. One of them introduced himself as Officer Anderson, while the other was Officer Patterson. Together, we entered the cabin, and what we found inside was a sight straight from a nightmare. A lifeless body lay on the living room floor, surrounded by a pool of crimson. The victim had been brutally murdered, and the scene was ghastly. My heart sank as I realized the horrifying reality of what had unfolded. As the officers began their investigation, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Officer Anderson, in particular, behaved strangely. He seemed overly interested in my presence at the scene, asking me numerous questions and repeatedly checking my identification. His probing inquiries made me deeply uncomfortable. The investigation continued, and it became evident that Officer Patterson was becoming increasingly uneasy as well. He pulled me aside and whispered that he suspected Officer Anderson might be involved in the crime. He urged me to stay vigilant and watch for any unusual behavior. As the hours passed, my fear grew. I couldn't escape the feeling that the murderer might be right under our noses. Officer Anderson's inquiries and demeanor only heightened my suspicion. It seemed he was trying to divert attention away from himself. In a chilling turn of events, Officer Patterson quietly confronted his colleague, accusing him of being involved in the murder. A heated argument ensued between the 2 officers, escalating to the point where they began physically fighting. It was a horrifying spectacle, watching those who were supposed to protect us turn on each other. As the struggle between the officers raged on, Officer Patterson managed to disarm his colleague and hold him at gunpoint. The truth was revealed, and it was more shocking than anything I could have imagined. Officer Anderson had indeed committed the murder and had attempted to frame me for the crime. The nightmare had only just begun. We restrained Officer Anderson, but he continued to issue threats and make chilling promises of revenge. It was clear that he was deeply unhinged. With the murderer apprehended, Officer Patterson called for backup, and additional units arrived to take Anderson into custody. The victim's family was informed, and the small town of Cedar Hollow was shaken to its core by the revelation. The line between protector and predator had blurred, and the horror of that night still sends shivers down my spine.